Okay, welcome back, everyone. I have the pleasure of starting up our keynote, but first, just introducing the moderator of our keynote, Bill Ivey. Many of you know Bill Ivey. Bill is the former chairman, seventh chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. He's a close friend of the Center for Cultural Affairs. He serves on our advisory board, and he's also started collaborating with us on a big project that we'll be working on this coming year. So Bill has become a friend and collaborator for this with the center, and also a friend of mine, I'm happy to say. So Bill is not only the former chairman, but a pretty prolific author. So he has a number of books, Engaging Art, he was co-editor of, but he wrote Arts Inc., which many of us have read, and also Handmaking America, and as well as Rebuilding an Enlightened World, which is his book that he just released, I believe, in 2019. Is that right, Bill? So, yeah, so I will just turn it over to you, Bill, and you will have the honor of presenting our keynote, introducing him.
Thank you, Joanna. I've really enjoyed all of the presentations today. I think everybody has been great. It's been a really good conference, and it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Valdemar Hofstein of the University of Iceland. I've known Professor Hofstein and his work for years. My experience gives me every confidence that his remarks will absolutely illuminate a set of international issues that will influence the shape of cultural policy around the world for decades to come. And I'm taking just a 2 minutes of personal privilege to introduce an issue that I think is perhaps relevant, and I think connects especially with the comments that followed our last panel. I've always felt for years the presence of a kind of deep question or unknown that lurks beneath the work of specialists, especially in U.S. cultural affairs. It's been with us here in the States for decades, and to me, suggests a challenge we will almost certainly face and resolve as we engage public diplomacy, public policy in the future, as we work to advance a vibrant cultural environment. I would frame our unknown this way. In the U.S. context, the big arenas of law and regulation, public policy, that carry profound cultural impact are almost never debated in cultural terms. Media ownership, internet access, intellectual property rights, access to corporation-owned cultural heritage, mergers and acquisitions in our cultural industries. These are debated and assessed exclusively in relation to pricing and other economic effects. Cultural impact, though sometimes profound, is simply not a metric within the FCC, the Federal Trade Commission, the Copyright Office, and other U.S. agencies of government that regulate the way power and enterprise within art and media are deployed. Uninterest on the part of power centers does not mean, however, that the U.S. does not possess a robust community of scholars and students interested in cultural affairs. I think witness this very conference. In fact, there exists plenty of expertise in policy and the arts in America, but areas of study have almost exclusively been those embedded in the nonprofit arts. And I think the subjects that have been addressed effectively today are mostly around the nonprofit arts. But unfortunately, that nonprofit cultural sector in which we have so much great specialization in cultural affairs, that sector has not been of much interest to big-time power brokers in foreign affairs, education, national defense, health, and so on. Nor have major corporations, even those that shape expressive life, engage culture very much as corporate policy. So the intriguing unanswered question that relates from those two, I think, truths: what would policymaking look like here in the US if government and business suddenly seized upon an aspect of culture to overtly, directly, and emphatically engage part of the US cultural scene? And if that happened, would it be a good thing? Would greater government interest that would stimulate business engagement, could it become simply too much of a good thing and in the end do more harm than good? Now, fortunately for our conversation today, An example of this kind of policy and entrepreneurial intervention exists. A little known in the US, but introduced very effectively by Michael Rushton this morning. In many other nations, the 2003 UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage has emerged over fewer than 20 years as a powerful accelerator of government passion for cultural matters. As both reality and metaphor, this UNESCO convention and its implementation around the world has important, even profound implications for all of us who work to advance the connection between public policy and the arts. And now we'll hear from exactly the right person. We'll hear from Professor Waldemar Hofstein, whose wide-ranging research, unique experience in policymaking, and deep understanding of the UNESCO ICH convention make his the perfect keynote voice as we begin together to wrap up our consideration of leadership's obligations to future societies. Vladimir Hofstein is Professor of Folklore and Ethnology at the University of Iceland. He received his PhD in 2004. He's a product of Berkeley's then cutting-edge folklore studies program. He's the author of 3 books on cultural heritage, the most recent one here, and numerous articles on folklore, cultural property, cultural rights, and copyright. And I know from experience that Waldemar's presentations are destinations for attendees at the annual meeting of the American Folklore Society. And following in the footsteps of his diplomat father, Waldemar has crafted a part-time career as public servant, representing his home country in numerous conferences and negotiations within UNESCO and the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. His film, The Flight of the Condor, an extension of his academic research, offers a surprising, amusing, and revealing examination of the forces that produced the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. So please welcome Professor Waldemar Hofstein.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for the generous introduction and for pitching both my book and my film. Just close the window, there's a plane flying by. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, across the continent and beyond. It's 7 p.m. here in Iceland. I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you for organizing this conference and for inviting me to take part. I've listened with curiosity and excitement to the lectures through the day, and it's certainly a privilege to have the last word or the last presentation. I'm also thankful that there's still a closing roundtable on the program after my talk, so I'm not the last thing standing between you and the happy hour. I know it's been a long day at the screen for many of you. I hope you like pictures of really buff guys in leather. I've lined up a collection of them. I'm kidding, but I got your attention, right? Now, I've got much better illustrations. Starting with this one, let's see if I can share my screen. Does that work? Yep.
Looks good.
Okay. Starting with this one. So what we've just heard and seen is a Moroccan storyteller practicing his art. You'll observe now another Moroccan storyteller on screen, 3 of them in succession, though somewhat scandalously I've silenced their speech so my own may be heard. Each of these storytellers, a halakai, has gathered around him a circle of listeners, a halka, a storytelling circle. These circles are a traditional form of public entertainment with a long history in Morocco. The storytellers work the same square and they vie for the attention of the crowds gathered there, competing with one another, but also with all the other acts and performers on the square. The square in question, some of you may recognize, is Jemaa el-Fnaa in Marrakesh. It's the site of a myriad performances: storytelling, snake charming, preaching, fortune-telling, human castle building and acrobatics, fire swallowing, and glass eating, my favorite, dancing animals, con artists, as well as dance and musical performances, to name a few. These street performers draw the crowds to Jemaa el-Fna, Moroccan and foreign. It's one of the busiest squares in Africa, a marketplace by the entrance to the Marrakesh Medina, the old city, which itself was inscribed on the UNESCO Heritage List in 1985. Teeming with people, Jemaa el-Fna is a meeting point for Marrakeshi city folk, rural Moroccans from the surrounding countryside, for travelers and for foreign tourists. The square also offers diverse services and products, from fruit stalls to fresh meats, from the finest barbecues to kebabs, from dental care to herbal medicine and tarot card readings, from henna tattooing to pickpocketing, and so on. In the evening, open-air restaurants take up a good deal of space. And until about 20 years ago, bourgeois society in Marrakesh looked upon this square with disdain. It saw Jemaa el-Fna by and large as an embarrassment, as an embarrassing symbol of backwardness, a dirty, primitive den of thieves. In the view of Morocco's ruling elite, Jemaa el-Fna sent signals to the world that Morocco had not yet fully entered modernity. In the mid-1990s, city authorities and businessmen planned to evacuate the square and demolish several buildings around it to make way for a high-rise glass shopping center, taller than the mosques. Under their plan, part of the square would have been in the mall, part of it would have been in the parking lot to serve the shoppers. Now you'll recognize, I think, a familiar story here, told in variants across the world, the narrative of loss and ruin. Nowadays, it often recounts the destruction of heritage at the hands of globalization. Now, several artists and intellectuals in Marrakesh responded with alarm to the construction of the plans. They were led by this man, Juan Guatisolo, Spanish laureate author, another great storyteller, a dissident who had left Franco's Spain and lived by the square for decades. And together with a few like-minded Moroccan friends, he formed an NGO, Les Amis de la Place, Friends of the Square. And they went to this building, the UNESCO building at Place Fontenoy in Paris. So from Marrakesh, the story moves to Paris, from Jemaa el-Fna to another square, Place Fontenoy, UNESCO's headquarters in the three-pointed star, a landmark in modernist architecture inaugurated in 1958 and declared at the time a triumph of the human spirit and concrete. Just love that phrase. Their timing was perfect. In the mid-1990s, UNESCO was preparing for what would be later become the Intangible Heritage Convention. In response, UNESCO organized a meeting in Marrakesh in 1997 on the preservation of popular cultural spaces. Cosmopolitan artist Juan Guatisolo flew to Paris to see UNESCO's Director General, Federico Mayor, a fellow Spaniard, poet, author, and academic. He brought the plight of Jemaa el-Fna to the attention of the international community, and he brought back with him to Jemaa el-Fna a team of UNESCO experts and a panel of international scholars and artists. The latest ambition of the bourgeoisie was to build a mall here, taller than the mosque, Guatisolo said in an interview at the time. The bourgeois live off the square, they live off the tourism that the square brings, but they don't realize that the tourists don't come here looking for malls. Well, what we're attempting, he added, and UNESCO's decision will help us in this, is to change the way many of Marrakesh's own inhabitants look at the square, so that they feel a justified sense of pride. And indeed, with the help of UNESCO, Guatisolo and his colleagues turned international attention to Jemaa el-Fna, if only for a moment. But a moment was enough. When influential foreigners began to praise the cultural space of Jemaa el-Fna, suggest that it had great significance as heritage, that really it deserved to be recognized as the intangible heritage of humanity as a whole, city authorities in Marrakesh finally got it. The linchpin was when the king came on board. And they got on board with Guatisolo's program. Instead of evacuating the square, they decided to preserve it. And this is, I think, where the story starts to be interesting. The authorities surveyed the dangers that threatened Jemaa el-Fna's living heritage, dangers that they were now going to defend the square against. These included a roster of items like modernization, globalization, urbanization, the growth of tourism, all of which they claimed threatened, quote, the authenticity of the acts and performances. To respond to these threats, city authorities, guided by UNESCO, created a local commission for the safeguarding of the square to implement a 10-year protection plan that included an urban planning study, creation of a research facility, and the identification of traditional performers. In addition, an early analysis of the impacts of UNESCO's recognition identified plans for weekly storytelling sessions, creation of prize competitions for storytelling, and an inventory of performers on the square, noting the particular skills of each one. The Medina governor also took the following measures. He had advertising billboards around the square torn down. He had new buildings demolished on the grounds that they were not suited to the traditional look and feel of the square. And the streets converging on the square were turned into pedestrian zones. Car traffic radically reduced around the square. And a few years later, in 2001, the cultural space of Jemaa Afna was one of the first 19 phenomena to be inscribed on UNESCO's Intangible Heritage List in its first instantiation. This story, the story of how Jemaa Afna was rescued from the blade of the bulldozer, is one of the success stories that UNESCO tells over and over again about its efforts to safeguard intangible heritage. In fact, it's also told as a story of origins for its programs. And indeed, the 1997 meeting in Marrakesh was a catalyst. It gave a boost to UNESCO's programs in the field, and it did help to usher in negotiations for what would become the Intangible Heritage Convention some years later. So, if we listen to the story, it's telling us that the rescue of Jemaa Afna and its traditional arts had worldwide repercussions. We're given to understand that. It brought us to Paris in 2003, and from there to any number of places around the globe in the last 18 years to safeguard intangible heritage in all its mind-blowing multiplicity. It brought me here today, right? So the story goes. I speak here as a folklorist who has worked on UNESCO and partly within UNESCO, as Bill said, and I apologize for the indulgence. I'm establishing my fieldworker credentials. I work partly within UNESCO, principally on intangible heritage. And as a folklorist, I'm always a sucker for good stories. And the story of Jemaa Afna is one of my favorite. When I began hanging out at UNESCO as a fieldworker, observing negotiations for what became the Intangible Heritage Convention, one of the things that caught my attention was the frequent reference to stories, very often short references to stories, the longer versions of which were obviously familiar to more experienced delegates and staff members. And getting to know these stories slowly and being able to tell them is part of the integration into the workplace, there like in most other workplaces. And that, by the way, I think is also one of the lessons of the current pandemic. What has been lost to organizations and companies when the offices have emptied out and everyone works from home is this space and time for informal exchange of knowledge and experience. Now, many of these stories explain what is going on or how it came about, and they justify the work being done. They suggest solutions to practical problems, or they support a particular vision of how things should be. Some of them are origin stories. That's to say, accounts of how something came to be, particularly powerful form of storytelling. To take one other example, what I'm talking about, stories told about the World Heritage Convention from 1972 recount how international cooperation in UNESCO's Nubia campaign rescued the Abu Simbel temples and other monuments from the Nubian Valley in the 1960s, before Egypt completed the Aswan High Dam and submerged the valley in water. A defining example, according to UNESCO, of international solidarity, when countries understood the universal nature of heritage and the universal importance of its conservation. Relocating the monuments beyond the reach of the flood, the success of these salvaged operations demonstrated the necessity of international cooperation to protect cultural heritage. So the story goes. Of course, there is more to it. The larger political context is also crucial to understanding the heritage diplomacy of the Nubia campaign. As sociologist Tim Winter has remarked, with the Soviet Union providing financial assistance for constructing the dam that would lead to the flooding of the valley further south, Abu Simbel presented a number of Western allies a great opportunity to assemble for a diplomatically expedient initiative, a project UNESCO has subsequently described as a triumph of international solidarity. With UNESCO, it's always a triumph. The international community came together once more in 1966 to save the built heritage of Venice in the wake of disastrous floods, again rallying experts and resources in an effort orchestrated by UNESCO. And these two campaigns, Save Nubia and Save Venice, are cited time and again in storytelling about the origins of the World Heritage Convention, why we have it, what it's good for. It was to confirm their commitment to this cooperation that member states of UNESCO created the convention. By becoming parties to the convention, they pledged to go on working together to save cultural heritage of outstanding value. So goes the story. Now, does it remind you of anything? The flood is coming, right? Build an ark. From the Sumerian flood myth in the tale of Zezudra, 17th century before the Common Era, to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, to the Abrahamic story of the flood and Noah's Ark in the book of Genesis, the flood is a frequent motif in myths of creation, recounting how the world and mankind came to be in their present circumstances. And outside of those Western Asian traditions, floods feature in traditional stories of origins among peoples as widely dispersed as the Maasai and Yoruba on the east and west coast of Africa, Hopis and Inuits in North America, Incas and Tupis in South America, Hawaii, Malaysia, Korea, China, in Hindu, Norse, and Greek mythologies, etc. Indeed, as folklorist Alan Dundes once noted, the flood myth is one of the most widely diffused narratives known. And we might add, with catastrophic climate change already well underway, this is not a narrative that's going to fade away anytime soon. In other words, what I'm driving at, storytelling in the UN is not so different from storytelling anywhere else. The invocation of the flood motif gives UNESCO a protagonist role equivalent to that of Noah in the book of Genesis, charged with the survival of creation as a whole. It frames the World Heritage Convention as its ark. As stories of origins, these narratives set the tone in which UNESCO likes to describe its efforts. Like other stories of origins, like say that of Adam and Eve, the apple and the snake, and the fall of man, UNESCO's origin stories purport to tell us something important about the object it originates, about the human condition in the one case of the one, about heritage in the case of the other. A number of stories account for the origins of the Intangible Heritage Convention. I heard them during fieldwork, first as a participant observer in the meetings where the convention was drafted, then later as an observant participant in meetings after the convention entered into force. The stories came up in formal interviews and informal conversations, in offices and corridors and elevators, cafeterias and coffee shops and lunch spots, all these spaces that the pandemic has emptied out. I also came across references to them, short and long, in archives and publications. And recounting or just referring to such stories, people give meaning to what they're up to or what they propose to do. To account for origins is to explain, to rationalize, to validate, to argue. One story about the origins of intangible heritage is set in Morocco, the one I just told you. But another one is set in Japan, featuring these temples, the Horeiji Buddhist temples pictured here, and the Shinto shrine in Ise. A third story is set in the Andes Mountains and features front and center a song you all know how to whistle, El Condor Pasa, and a letter from 1973 sent from the Bolivian government to UNESCO's Director General. That should have been a trailer for the film that Bill Ivey referred to rolling here, but it stopped rolling for some reason. Anyway, it's in open access on Vimeo in case you're interested. Now, the story I've told you today is one of the stories told within UNESCO by one person to another and by UNESCO as part of its self-presentation to account for the origins of the Intangible Heritage Convention and for the rationale for these kinds of programs, where it comes from, how it got started, what it's good for, why it's needed. It's also a success story, and that makes it an interesting starting point, I think. Now, of course, success is a time-limited thing, right? The Roman Empire was hugely successful, it's fair to say, but where is it now? The success of the success story relies on ending the story at just the right moment and then not following up. So let's do just that. Let's follow up. Let me take you back to Marrakesh. The story often ends with the phrase, "and the square is still there," offered as a resolution to the narrative. And the square is still there. And indeed, it still is there in all its splendor and squalor and humanity. Kudos to Guatisolo and to the Moroccan intellectuals and artists working with him. Kudos to UNESCO and to Moroccan and Marrakeshi authorities. Instead of a shopping center and a parking lot, musicians and glass eaters still perform to the crowds in Jemaa el-Fna. Astrologists and water sellers still hawk their services. Instead of one voice, there are many. Instead of sameness, difference. The square is still there. And yet, not all is as it was. Something has happened. For all of us to deal with cultural policy, it's important to understand that safeguarding is a tool of transformation. It transforms relationships, places, practices. And that transformation also affects the places and practices themselves. The square is still there, but a standardized cart on wheels with a traditional look and feel is now mandatory for all the food vendors. A nostalgic design introduced by city authorities and the Safeguarding Council in 2005. The city government also ordered shops around the square to harmonize their storefronts and use uniform large green parasols. With a 10-year plan, a local commission, weekly storytelling sessions, competitions, traffic diversion, and inventories of performers, Marrakeshi authorities, cultural workers have left no stone unturned in their effort to orchestrate difference, to organize Jemaa el-Fna as a cultural space characterized by harmony and by a pleasant distribution of colors and sounds and products and services. An administrative grid has been superimposed on the square. It's invisible to the human eye, intangible to the human hand, but very real in its effects. With cultural policy to safeguard the cultural space, city authorities and the ruling class are actually finally succeeding, where before they had always failed. They have brought order to Jemaa el-Fna, or are doing so. Now, the irony of this story is that the principal threat to Jemaa el-Fna's continued existence as a marketplace was posed by the city authorities themselves. But it is they who have undertaken to safeguard the square against this threat. To say the fox is guarding the hen house is perhaps to overreach, but not in the wrong direction. In safeguarding the square, they have changed it. Sure enough, Jemaa el-Fna is still busy with life, still teeming with people selling, buying, performing, watching, listening, taking part, passing through at least certain times of the day. But whereas before fire swallowers and musicians, food stalls and preachers seem to be all over the place, they are now and increasingly each in their proper place. Chaos is making way for order and the performances and services are being zoned. Which begs the question, is that the alternative to the shopping center? Is that the alternative to the parking lot? Is no place left for difference? Are we faced with a choice between, on the one hand, eliminating difference for the sake of good parking, the Body Shop and Gap, or on the other hand, choreographing difference under the sign of heritage in a neatly ordered performance of pleasant diversity? Between Scylla and Charybdis, between the devil and the deep blue sea, for that is, I think, the dilemma posed by the success story of Jemaa el-Fna. When we probe it, when we refuse to stop at that coda and the square is still there, without intervention, without safeguarding, without cultural policy, we're left with a parking lot and yet another shopping mall. Remember Joni Mitchell's lament?
Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? It gave paradise, put up a parking lot.
True. Now, to my mind at least, there is no doubt that the Marrakeshis, the Moroccans, and ourselves here, humanity as a whole, would be the poorer for it. But precisely because of that, the details of the policy and the ways in which it's implemented matter a great deal. Folklorist Deborah Caption began her ethnographic work on the square in 1994, a few years before UNESCO held its international consultation there, before Guatisolo and the other artists and intellectuals formed the NGO, Friends of the Square. And 20 years later, she recalled the changes that came with the proclamation of the square as the intangible heritage of humanity. And she writes that, quote, in preparation for the rehabilitation of the square, Moroccan authorities relocated all the herbalists to another single section of the square. What's more, they were told to cease their verbal performances. Obviously, the cleaning up and preservation of Jemalfna and Marrakesh required a codification of roles in the square. And since herbalists are not in the UNESCO categories of storytellers, acrobats, or musicians, their own brand of verbal art was not recognized and was ultimately silenced. And there's more. As I noted earlier, to safeguard Jemalfna, the Medina governor reduced car traffic and created a pedestrian zone in the streets that converge on the square. Now, these measures may sound helpful for the performing artists, the halakha on the square, taking away noise and smell and pollution and the distraction of motor traffic, right? In fact, they were devastating, especially to the storytellers, whose stories are told in Arabic or Berber and require an audience who understand the language, right? So already in 1985, when the Marrakesh Medina was added to the World Heritage List, the bus station that had been on Jemalfna was moved away. That still left shared taxi ranks on the square. But as part of the governor's measures, the taxis also moved from the square as motor traffic through Jemalfna was more or less closed off. This changed the cultural space of the square, sure enough, but not as the safeguarding plan intended. In interviews with storytellers in Jemalfna, ethnomusicologist Thomas Beardsley found that they, by and large, blamed the demise of their trade on the removal of the bus stop and the taxi ranks. These storytellers, even more so than the musicians, depend on pedestrian traffic. You saw them earlier at the opening slides, right? And they depend specifically on Moroccan, Arabic, or Berber-speaking audiences with a bit of time to kill. And the presence of the transportation hubs meant that the storytellers had a fairly regular supply of audience members coming from the crowds on buses and taxis. Once these were removed, that supply dwindled dramatically. No longer the flood of workers leaving the tanneries in the afternoons, no more daytime traffic and waiting crowds from the intercity bus stations, no morning and evening rush of workers reaching other parts of the city in shared taxis. For most of the day, in fact, the square is a vast, hot, fairly empty space, save for a few snake charmers and henna tattooers that relatively few people visit until evening, aside from a few wandering foreigners looking really puzzled as to why Jemalfna is so famous. So that's my story for you today, or my version of this story. The square is still there as the coda, right? But let me add my own coda. To me, the most encouraging upshot of the creation of intangible heritage, the concept as well as the convention, is that it brings together various people who before inhabited different cultural categories. And that, I think, is an important contribution to our common imagination. What unites beer culture in Belgium with Chinese shadow puppetry? What does Estonian smoke sauna have in common with kimchi making in Korea? Or the corporea circle in Brazil with violin craftsmanship in Cremona, Italy, Indonesian batik, Croatian lace making, Arabic coffee, Argentinian tango, and so on. And you guessed it, of course, they're all on UNESCO's representative list of the intangible heritage of humanity. And that means they've been selected to represent the diversity of human creative powers. They're chosen because they give aesthetic form to deeply held values. They speak of skill and competence, they speak of bonds that tie, and of different relationships to history, society, and nature. They testify to, I think, the various ways in which people tend to previous generations and to other people, to the future. UNESCO's representative list, in other words, is an attempt to display humanity at its best, showcasing its capacity to create beauty, form, and meaning out of its various particular circumstances, sharing what they enjoy or what they must endure, to paraphrase Del Hymes, people give form to value in their cultural practices and performances. And then new generations recreate these forms according to their own conditions. They cultivate the talent, the knowledge, the appreciation necessary. And that's a rich source of creativity, a rich source of identity and emotion and community and life. It's what Bill Ivey and I refer to as folklore. That's to say, the creative dynamics of vernacular, expressive, and everyday culture through which people make sense of the world and their place within it, and through which they share these with one another. And it's this creative dynamic that the 180, let me say that number again, the 180 states parties to the Intangible Heritage Convention have pledged to safeguard, support, and cultivate. The convention makes us all responsible for the continued viability of these cultural practices. So make no mistake, the convention, as I think I've also illustrated, is flawed in some fundamental ways. And at times it's counterproductive, harming where it should help. But having said that, it is what we've got. We're stuck with it for better or worse. There's not going to be another one in our lifetimes. 180 states have ratified it, which makes it already pretty much universal and pretty much inevitable. The US is one of 13 states still holding out in the UN for the time being. Now, to put my cards on the table, I think the world is better off with the convention than without it. It doesn't put it beyond reproach. It's not even to say that it's good. It's not. But the alternative is worse. So that's a pragmatic stance. What it invites us to do is to imagine diverse customs, cultural practices, traditional expressions, and what unites them. What singing has in common with knitting? What building has in common with dancing? What's the common denominator of cooking and carving, gardening and acupuncture and playing the accordion? And what unites them is this aesthetic capacity to make beauty, form, and meaning out of innumerable particular circumstances. Capability to relate to previous generations through these expressions and practices that rehearse their words and sounds and gestures, and the social ability to share these with others. So, flawed as it is, imperfect and inadequate, the Intangible Heritage Convention is about enabling this dynamic. And to stand a chance of sometimes succeeding, it needs a critical eye as well as a caring hand from you lot. It could really do with the contribution of cultural policy professionals and academics in the US. Thank you for your attention.
Valdemar, thank you very much. Questions, I think you could unmute yourself and just ask a question. Anyone? I've got a quick one, maybe not so quick, but do you feel that the arc that you described from identifying threat to policy creation to some new form that results when preservation policy is implemented, is that an arc that's kind of inevitable? Have you seen examples where that doesn't happen, where you don't go from one kind of problem to maybe a lesser one, but still a different kind of problem? Is it hardwired, as we would say in the US, is it hardwired into the process?
Well, I mean, some of the elements are hardwired. So, I mean, some of the things hardwired into the process is that you need to organize, right? You need to make policy. In order for that, you need to gather a certain number of people to whom you will delegate powers that before were distributed among a wider part of the population. That's part of the danger, right? It can involve disempowering others, possibly disengaging people, the people who carry the heritage forward, and there are examples of that. But there are also a lot of examples of good practices or best practices where people have carefully avoided that trap. But that's, I think, the importance of critique, to be aware of that and to study the problems as well, so we can figure them out. I mean, it's a part of ICH is that it brings such social institutions into being. It multiplies them. There's a proliferations of new institutions, councils, committees, juries, managers for safeguarding intangible heritage all over the world now. And it's not that it doesn't need safeguarding. In many cases, it most certainly needs it. But it's crucial to consider the unintended consequences, I think, of such interventions. And earlier there was a reference to a distinction. Let me see, I noted it down somewhere in my notes. Distinction between intentional policies and unintentional cultural policies. But we could add, intentional cultural policies may have unintended consequences, and non-intentional, unintentional cultural policies may have intended consequences, like a parking lot. So, that's there's maybe a refinement we can make with that.
Other questions?
Yeah, I'm really grateful to have heard this awesome talk, and really also pleased to hear abundant reference to folkloristic scholarship. And IU is also very fortunate to be to have both the Center for Cultural Affairs and a historic department of folklore and ethnomusicology, which is my home institution. And a lot of my colleagues in that department are very concerned with the correlation between the kinds of power dynamics that you've recounted through ICH designated practices and the legacy of colonial domination that we continue to grapple with in the world today, and so the story of Jama al-Fna, which you told in a very compelling way and to great effect. It's like many accounts of ICH designated practices in the global South, in that it's a project of coalition building between working class practitioners and elite, albeit benevolent, individuals from wealthy European superpowers and their derivatives in North America, Australia. And I want to know your perspective on whether there is a way to conduct this kind of global cultural policy making that doesn't give credence to the colonial legacy of economic and technological inequity that we see between countries like the United States and Morocco, for example.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you for an excellent question as well. I mean, history is not going to go away, right? It's there in every act we perform, the weight of it on our shoulders, and so I think it's rather than trying to create or find examples without history, we need to work against it and be aware of it. I know that in our field there are a lot of people who are extremely skeptical of intangible heritage and of the safeguarding program. I'm a pragmatic, so I mean, it's there. This ship has sailed. It's sailing with or without us, and it's going to be steered a whole lot better if we're on board. So that's my stance. I put myself out there for that. Not everyone agrees with that, but that's okay too. I think the critics are very much needed, and the skepticism is well warranted and needed as well. Yeah, is that an answer?
I think it's
Other
the
questions?
Yes, I would have a question, if I may. Thank you so much for the presentation, and it was really interesting to see the example of Jama el-Fna, having been there as a tourist, and I've just been schooled once more, as it happens, when you join these discussions, because I only know it as a tourist. So I mean, I can still only recommend if anybody has a chance to go there, because it is the transformation from the day to the very buzzing vibe of the evening is something that I've never experienced in this way ever. And as I said in my comment in the chat, which disappeared when we were kicked out, it is really interesting because you can also stand there and listen to the storytellers, and you kind of understand their stories without even understanding a word that they're saying. I think that's also part of the whole, the vibe, I don't have a better word, of the place. What I was wondering, because I've kind of looked into the tangible heritage as well in my studies, and I was wondering for the intangible heritage that is now being considered to be preserved and saved by the UNESCO guidelines. Do you, because I mean, like we have the impact of mass tourism that destroys places and, you know, puts risks for, or puts communities at risk, as we see now, who have been heavily dependent on tourism in the past and are now with COVID-19 and the pandemic, the travel restrictions, well, facing very deep crises. And I know that the UNESCO has been looking into kind of helping out there. Do you know if there have been any applications for the intangible heritage that have been withdrawn by communities in order to, you know, maybe not fall is the wrong word, but it maybe, you know, have this national level of work and effort to preserve a heritage rather than going through the big international UNESCO policies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one of the requirements for nominating a practice to UNESCO's representative list is that is the prior informed consent and the cooperation at every step of the route in the nomination process, from documenting to creating the file of the communities involved. Now, of course, community is a slippery term, right? Getting one person involved doesn't mean that you know, many others aren't against it. We don't have good representative mechanisms for a lot of communities, right? So the people you'll talk to are usually the ones who are already best connected to the outside and perhaps therefore marginal at home. But there are indeed cases of withdrawal. There are also cases of where the executive committee of the convention has sent nominations back because it was clear that, you know, only lip service had been paid to cooperation and informed consent. So there are a number of such cases. But of course, like, you know, it is a politicized committee. It's only partially staffed with people like us representing their countries. A lot of people there are what they call experts, which means lawyers, and they are, you know, representing other interests. So that's but it's an interesting fora as well to see. I mean, I'm interested in how the concepts that come out of our fields, the concepts and outlooks and the things we study, and what life they have then in these international fora, when the concepts that come out of the work of folklorists and anthropologists and cultural policy workers go into these diplomatic halls and are twisted around and then go back to work in the world, and people start referring to their practices as my intangible heritage, you know, as my traditional knowledge, or my intangible culture. This is my ICH, I'm practicing my ICH. Isn't that a miracle that people would actually be practicing their ICH? I mean, this term has gone into circulation, which is incredible. But it was, you know, they abandoned folklore for this, right, as a term. Yeah. Sorry, I'm on a rant.
Valdemar, you've been involved with the UNESCO convention, you know, creating it, interpreting it, applying it. You've also worked with WIPO, with the World Intellectual Property Organization. And I wonder if you would just say a word, because that's another international body and another mechanism for connecting interests with traditional culture, with small communities. And I'm just wondering if you would say a word or two, because I think public policy specialists perhaps are not as knowledgeable about WIPO either, not as engaged, and might say a word or two.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Yes. Yeah, WIPO used to be the World Intellectual Property Organization, used to be the bureau of the Berne Convention for copyright, and then took over a lot of other duties and became one of the UN organizations in 1971. Prior to that, copyright was administered by UNESCO along with everything else cultural. And already in the 1960s, under UNESCO's auspices, work had begun on the protection of folklore, both from a sort of general safeguarding perspective, but also more particularly from a copyright perspective. And this was brought on largely by the decolonization of the post-war period, in which the member states of the UN went from, you know, a few dozen to more than 100 in a short period, with all the newly independent states, who were all more or less forced to continue copyright laws, to continue with the copyright laws that the colonizers had imposed, but they wanted something for their own, and folklore was, what they had, what they claimed, and that needed protection. So a lot of work had begun in the 60s and the 70s on this. And in the early 80s, a treaty was proposed on the protection of traditional knowledge and folklore, and that, spectacularly failed in both UNESCO and WIPO and died. And after that, the two organizations parted ways. So UNESCO is about general safeguarding, and the Intangible Heritage Convention is what came out of that process. Whereas on the other hand, the intellectual property and economic aspects were taken over by WIPO, where there is still a committee that started in 2000 on intellectual property, genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and folklore, trying to negotiate a new treaty or treaties on the topic. 21 years later, I've been following the work now for 20 years, and it's not near completion, let's say. But it's a very different forum, different stakes, very different settings. The UN opened up to NGOs and civil society as a policy in the 2000s, but the different organizations have implemented very differently. So UNESCO is a heavily state-centered organization. Really, the states own the day there. I remember in some of the meetings I was in when the Intangible Heritage Convention was negotiated, there were a couple of NGOs who had been allowed to sit at the back. They could not take the floor or speak until all the states had finished speaking. No one had anything to say. And then they could not contradict anything that a state had said at that point. That's UNESCO. WIPO is a very different story. They've opened up, more than any other UN organization to civil society. And there's real NGOs there. UNESCO mostly has its own, it creates its NGOs and then says it's, has a lot of civil society participation. So ICOM, the International Council of Museum, is an NGO created by UNESCO, with which UNESCO consults a lot, for example. WIPO opened up, and it's in Geneva, where a lot of other negotiations are going on at the International Labour Organization and various other organizations, human rights, which indigenous NGOs have been very interested in. And partly for the reason of where it's placed, a lot of those NGOs heard what was happening. WIPO came along, and they've really put their mark on the process. So it's gone from a state-centered process, where it began, where the African states wanted recognitions that the states owned all the folklore in their territories. Mm-hmm. And you had to get permission from a state council to perform it or record it. It's been taken over by the indigenous NGOs, more or less, the process, or diverted to a much, more well-considered, thoughtful process about recognition and appropriation. But the scene is very different in these places, and yet there is of course a back and forth between them.
Other questions for Waldemar?
Well, I'll jump in there. First of all, Waldemar, thank you very much for your talk. We learned a tremendous amount from that. We've been doing the case of the square in Marrakesh in our class here in our master's program in arts administration. So there's so much to it that it's great to use. This question relates to both Bill bringing up WIPO and as well as intangible cultural heritage. It seems to me that the two stories are linked in terms of WIPO recognizing or starting to recognize traditional knowledge or community knowledge, and intangible cultural heritage, in that in both cases, it talks about a cultural practice as a community, necessarily a community. And the reason this might strike sort of, say, Western audiences as different is because we often very much think in terms of artist and audience. And so it's an individual artist creates something, and then different people consume it in a particular way. And in both the WIPO case you're talking about and intangible cultural heritage, it doesn't work that way. The square exists as intangible cultural heritage because it is a community thing, and WIPO the same. So I just wondered about your thoughts, if this is a way to look at it, and perhaps some of the misunderstandings that arise.
Thank you. I mean, that's a fraught question and complex, but I'll give it a try. Michael, thank you. I mean, there was a reference this morning with Steve, right? who talked about Brian Eno's quote that that in the past no one had listened to the same song twice. That this was something particular to era. In the future, nobody would want to listen to the same music, the same song twice. The way I understand that, I don't know if that was the intention, but is the fact that there's a historian, Thomas Petit, who talks about the Gutenberg parentheses. I don't know if you're familiar with it. We're living in a brief anomalous period of the Gutenberg period, right? Where cultural production takes place in centers, starting with the printing press, the studio, and is distributed from there to people who we call audience, who are passive receivers, right? This is the Gutenberg model of cultural production and reception. He talks about the Gutenberg parenthesis because before Gutenberg, before the printing press, this is not how culture worked. Culture went between people, right?
Yeah.
And he calls it Gutenberg parenthesis because with the digital revolution, we're closing that parenthesis. Culture again is going between people and not from centers out to people. And I think the reason that people never heard the same song twice in the past is that they would themselves reproduce it, but it would be slightly different. That's what we call folklore, right? That's how traditional culture works. That's also how digital culture works, right? You take it and you tweak it, you change it, and it goes back out. So you never hear the same song twice in that sense, so you wouldn't want to do it because you can do so much more interesting stuff with it than just listen to it again unchanged. So I think that captures, to bring it back to your question, the sense that, in that sense, all cultural production is communal, right? It all belongs to a community because we're always building on something that came before and tweaking it. Sometimes some people tweak it more, some less, right? What we call tweaking it a little more, we call that originality, right? But that's still building on something else, at least the genre and nothing else, which, so the communal base of culture for me is obvious in these fora and these negotiations for that reason. But having said that, for example, in the Intangible Heritage Convention, the only undefined term is that of community. Everything else is defined, and intangible heritage is defined as the expressions, practices, etc., of communities, groups, and in some cases individuals that contribute to their identity and whatever, right? The thing that goes undefined is what is that community? And that means actually it's up to the states to define who are the communities that they're going to engage with. And that actually is a big blank check, isn't it? Because they're going to figure out who speaks for what community and who is the community and what are the communities. And so, in Spain, for example, Basques are not recognized, Catalans are not recognized under these terms, right? Or at least the last time I checked. They said we have traditional communities, but we don't recognize autonomous local communities as such. So, the government can decide who they're going to talk to, right? That's, yeah.
Perhaps we have time for one more quick question for Valdemar before we move to our general roundtable discussion. Anyone? Well, I will take this opportunity to thank Valdemar for what was a very, very informative and I think useful address, which kind of ties a nice bow around many of the themes that we've been dealing with all day today. So thank you very much. And I notice we don't have a break, so I throw things back to Michael and to Joanna, and we will have a more general discussion of what we've all heard today. Thank you again, Valdemar.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so it's been thrown back, and I think we were just going to have some general discussion, and by general and by discussion, we really do mean wide open. This is the time to relax. I've only been able to see a few people. Casey, I wonder if we can leave sort of the spotlight and just go to the big panel view so we can all see each other.
The spotlight mode is off. If you hit view in the top right corner, you can change it to the gallery view, and then you can see everybody.
Wow. Well, hello, everybody.
Oh, okay.
All right. So we're glad that so many people could come out today. I know that many of you must have a certain amount of Zoom fatigue, and so it's nice nice that so many of you can come. So I leave this wide open. This can draw on things that you heard today specifically, or sort of really big picture 30,000 feet questions that arose out of the whole conference, but do just jump right in. I leave it open here.
Exactly. It could be things that you didn't hear that you were expecting to hear. Also, now's a chance to get in a thought that would be a new one. And as people are about to do that, I want to say thanks to Voldemar and all the speakers. It was fantastic. So thank you all.
I wonder if Michael or Joanna or Doug could comment on kind of your sense of how much your mainstream public policy colleagues in the O'Neill School have some awareness of this intangible cultural heritage, or maybe WIPO policy, and how important it is in other parts of the world, not so much in the US for some peculiar reasons we could go into, but probably won't. But I just wonder what is your impression? Because to me, it's a very robust, maybe that's not the right word, it's a rich area in which you have very public policy that really is making a difference, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but that is that's not, in my impression, not all that pursued in the U.S.
Yeah, well, I can say in our master's degree program, and maybe I'll give ourselves a bit of credit here. We cover many of these topics, and so the conventions on tangible and intangible cultural heritage, the Convention on Cultural Diversity, World Intellectual Property Organization, and more of a domestic issue, but we're increasingly looking at sort of the return of questions around antitrust when it comes to major tech companies, which has become quite a news item lately, regulation of social media, which again is a fairly difficult issue, and on which there's a lot of often political confusion about what people think the laws actually are, what the First Amendment actually says, things like this, and also just industry concentration. And since we do have sort of a continual change in laws, 2 years ago when I used to teach antitrust law, I would talk about the Paramount decrees in American movie making. And then mid-semester, I had to say, oh, the Department of Justice has said, never mind, we're not going to enforce that anymore because streaming has changed everything. And so there's so many changes going on, but we really do try to incorporate a lot of this in our degree program. So hopefully our students are going out armed with some international understanding of these issues and treaties, and what the challenges are.
And I'll just add a little bit to that. I think we're a little different. Our specializations and expertise, I think, influence things in ways that I'm not sure generalize well to other public affairs programs and curricula around the country. I think in some ways it's, unless you're in international trade or in law, and you're looking at a lot of these IP issues, this stuff doesn't come up. And I'll say that the optimistic side of this to me is that we're increasingly post 2020, I think, investing a lot more sincere and significant energy into notions of narratives and people's lived experiences. And I think that ends up potentially being a really strong connector and gateway into a lot of these issues, not coming at it necessarily from a cultural affairs sort of perspective, but from other perspectives, get us into this space where we're really starting to talk about some intangibles. And it's not just sort of evaluating circumstances based on material wealth or on commerce. We're talking about thinking about things in broader ways. And so I don't think we're really there yet in general. O'Neill School may be ahead of that curve in some ways, but I think we've got potential to really grow this in a couple different directions. That gives me some hope.
If I could actually make a comment, I'm a planner and I've done capstone projects with our graduate students, and we have a number of different backgrounds from these students in the arts, nonprofit, economic development. I worked in a small town south of Bloomington, Mitchell, Indiana, and lo and behold, we found an opera house that was being used as storage with the fire department and some other things. So we looked at that. We had our environmental people look at the issues on getting the bats out, the Indiana bats out of the building. We had, I think I mentioned to Michael or some other people, can this venue actually support itself in the future if we actually have it as a venue? And short story on this, students did an excellent job, a lot of different things. And for students that are not in the arts, this is looking at patrons for you guys in the future. They loved it. It performs right now and it has great bluegrass music, which my wife and I have gone to.
Thank you. Eddie, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'd just like to mention a couple things that have happened up here in Canada in the last bunch of years, like from a cultural policy perspective. We've had a couple of inquests very specific to like Indigenous people and everybody else, like the the colonizers, for lack of a better term. One was the Truth and Reconciliation. There's a commission that was struck, and then they did a massive inquiry, and there's a really great report that like is all encompassing, and it's got recommendations to follow for every sector, even the cultural sectors. So it's something that you, I guess, throughout the States, you might not have such a document prepared or produced, but up here we have that, and it's informing a lot. There isn't like nearly enough action on it, but we have it. And then there's a subsequent murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry and report that has just come out. And I know based on the findings from last week out, there's probably going to be a massive inquiry into exactly like how far things have gone. I mean, the issue with residential schools, it's not new, it's not a surprise, but I think just the hidden information and all the people who maybe even are still around that got away with what they got away with, I think there's going to be an inquiry coming, and all that information is going to have to come out. But for now, I think the Truth and Reconciliation report and the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls reports here in Canada could be really useful for you guys to look at. I think there's a lot of applicable information, because really the border between Canada and the US is it's an invisible barrier, and it wasn't always there,
Any other thoughts and perspectives to share?
Well, Doug, I guess I'll just offer one piece. I'm just mostly listening today, and as I'm thinking about this, what's after the colon in the title of the conference, right? What do we owe to future generations? I'm reflecting back on all I've heard and thinking about what's one thing that I heard today that I want to think about in the context of how we owe it to future generations. I don't have an answer to that, but I would be curious if others have been thinking on that point and have anything to offer.
I was thinking about that as well, if you'll bear some more of my ranting, but it's, I think, what do we owe to future generations? I thought it was a great question. And it's really, in terms of cultural policy, preserving culture, whether it's an object or a practice for future generation is, I think, it's a fundamentally optimistic act, like all time capsules. I'm thinking of the Voyager shuttles that NASA launched in the 1970s. They would have now left the solar system carrying on board a golden record with a sampling of the sounds of Earth, voices of humanity, and then mostly music, the Western canon from Bach to Chuck Berry, and music from around the world, from Javanese gamelan to Peruvian panpipes. Alan Lomax, folklorist, worked heavily on this with Carl Sagan. And their destination, or their intended audience, if you like, is intelligent life in outer space, which, given the speed at which they travel, they're unlikely to find for several tens of thousands of years. Which means that, when those intelligent life forms discover these recordings and figure out how to play them, humanity will probably no longer exist, right? These will be its only extant traces, perhaps, final farewell, as it were. But it's a fundamentally hopeful act to think that Chuck Berry and Bach will find an interested audience even then, right? It's in a way the Golden Record is a relative of UNESCO's programs, right? It grows out of some of the same impulses, same fields, even some of the same people are involved. This kind of safeguarding of heritage assumes, first of all, that there will be future generations, which is not a given all we know. But more importantly, that these future generations will care about some of the things that we care about, that they will share our priorities, our judgment, our sensibilities, and that they'll care about us, that they'll find it interesting to learn about us and to engage with our cultural practices. And Doug Noonan, you referred earlier to this, or our presumptions about future generations. And it's not only a hopeful stance, I think it's also a bit egotistical, right? There's an inflated sense of self-importance here, at least a bit of ego stroking involved, right? We want to safeguard our cultural practice for the future because we want the future to relate to us. These are our children, after all, our children's children. And we want them to acknowledge us and to take an interest. And we hope they're going to be something like us and that they're going to like us, right? But at the same time, it's also an act of caring and kindness, I think. It's not necessarily that they'll want to be like us, but rather that it is our duty, I think, to make sure that they have a rich, broad, deep, and diverse repertoire of culture as a baseline from which to do the stuff they want to do. Those were my thoughts that I was thinking of as I thought about the title, and I couldn't fit it into the lecture, but that's brewing there.
I think it's, to build on Valdemar's point, I think it's very important that we try to build a frame, legal and custom and practice and so on, that allows access on the part of future generations to heritage. In other words, the U.S., we've certainly exported it effectively, but we've had a great deal of confidence in the marketplace in terms of preserving gobs of culture, and lots and lots of, the Chuck Berry performance is really something that was created in a commercial context, and it's preserved in a commercial context. And some years back, when the Library of Congress started to designate individual recordings and groups of recordings that were singled out for special attention, preservation, and so on, the major record labels refused to even give them a perfect preservation copy of the original because the labels did not want to acknowledge that there was any public claim on that property. The idea was that once you say that the government can request for the Library of Congress a pristine copy of Good Golly Miss Molly, then that means in the future they can own it. In other words, you're laying the groundwork to lose this piece of property. And the problem is that at the other end, at the commercial side, as all of that music is now in the vaults that are controlled by basically 3 global corporations, you no longer have a public interest commitment to access. And I think that is a key addition to what Valdemar said. We want people to care. We want them to be able to reinterpret, ignore, or advance ideas that we don't think are important, but the access, the process of getting to things needs to be there. And that could close up on us, and maybe already has.
Bill, you speak to something that I've been thinking about throughout the conference too, which is not only access, but there's a certain point at which some of us need to just move out of the way, right? So it's not only just allowing access to to heritage and for those people who, for future generations, but it's also the current generation just sort of moving out of the way and letting the future generation take hold. So I thought about that a lot with respect to some of the panels today, because so much of what we discussed, actually, I felt as if there were misinterpretations that we were trying to come to agreements about what something meant. And when you think about those conversations, trying to figure out what something means, a lot of those conversations are generational. So I might think one thing because I'm of a particular generation, but thinking about my students may think that means something else because they're of a particular generation. And so I feel like there will be a point of time that I just need to move out of the way and let the people who are coming behind me take over. And so I think that that's a large, like there's a place for policy in that approach as well, which is recognizing that, recognizing there's a point of time that we have to sort of give it over to the next generation and be okay with it. And I think that is true not only for cultural heritage, but also so many things, that are happening within politics, society, et cetera. But that seemed to be a constant theme that came up with me. And maybe it's just where I am in my place in life, which is sort of, I have more interaction with younger generations than I've ever had with my students and my children, et cetera. So I'm always thinking sort of what can I give over? But I do think that was just a common thread that came up all the time throughout every panel.
I think there's a piece of this also, from the preservation side and the sort of the environmental analogy. There's a bit of a Noah's Ark problem often where we can only save so much and we have to figure out what things we want to preserve and put on the ark. But there's an implicit part of this is that there's a question, I guess, that's implicit about if we're going to make judgments on which to save and which not to save, what guides it? And quite often, I think we're talking about saving even things that aren't our favorite parts of nature or parts of culture. Or are we leaving the skunks behind? Are we leaving smallpox behind? Are we leaving mosquitoes behind? Or are we bringing all of it? Because what we owe to future generations is a chance to have the maximal access to things, whether they like it or not, because who wants to presuppose their tastes? And so we owe it to them to preserve all of it, at least a sampling of all of it, even the distasteful stuff. And I think that's an interesting piece because what's distasteful is whatever kids today like. I can't stand their taste in music and things, right? And so it gets right at this generational bit about what is distasteful and should Chuck Berry or should Western European things be on the ark at all? Kind of these questions are, I think, permeated a lot of today. And I'm excited to see these things get actually discussed out in the open.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that. And I think that it's difficult to overestimate just how hard that actually is, to be able to look at a policy and always be asking who's being left behind here, in what's being preserved or what's being favored. And it can so easily fall into tokenism, as Eleonora Belfiore and Stephen Hadley reminded us earlier, with concepts like cultural equity, cultural diversity, cultural democracy. And we can even see it with principles like do no harm or, engage with history. It's actually takes a lot of work. It takes, learning new languages and learning new techniques for communicating and building, tolerance for things that, you might find really challenging. So I just want to totally underscore that point. Thank you.
Maybe adding to what Christian just said, I'm wondering if, because being human, we are innately not perfect. And I'm wondering whether there is an actual complete 100% fairness in when we decide what should be saved. So trying to not put different values on different heritages or on different things that might, or that we try to leave for the future generations, because I think from the representation of what is being put on the different lists, you can already see that there is a difference between the global South, global North, and last but not least, that also comes down to when you look at the former colonial nations, and you know what had been put on the first list of heritages when the whole concept came about. So I'm wondering whether there is an actual 100% chance that we cover everything, as long as we are maybe unconsciously putting different values on different things, maybe because we don't understand it yet, or because other people or other, well, countries, nations, communities have not had the chance to have their heritage preserved.
I think we do some choices on cultural heritage fairly explicitly. So here at Indiana University, we have a truly great school of music. The Jacobs School of Music is one of the best schools of music at a public university in the country. And a huge amount of resources is devoted to the preservation of Western classical music. Like just a fantastic amount. And if you look at how our arts councils deliver funding to different nonprofit arts organizations, again, Western classical music and opera are generously funded. And if we look to the private sector in foundations and charitable donations, again, we find these are very rich organizations. The major symphony orchestras in the United States, the major art opera companies are extremely well funded. The budget for the Metropolitan Opera is, I can't remember, it's a really big number, right? And so a judgment has been made because these are art forms with essentially small audiences. The proportion of the population who listens to opera, even in a country where this is, you know, a Western country, is very small. And likewise, classical music. And so we do implicitly make these judgments. Now we can say it's wrong, we can say it's justified, but I think a decision is being made by public agencies, by foundations, by individual charitable donors, that there are some art forms that are above the others in terms of what warrants protecting it and keeping it alive for future generations. After all, music schools are called conservatories. It's being conserved, right? That's the idea. And so I think judgments actually are being made. And we can question them, or we can say, actually, it's the right thing to do. But I think people are actually making implicit choices that way.
I have a comment, if that's all right. Hi, my name's Jenny. I'm a PhD candidate in the ethnomusicology program. And I've jumped in and out today because of other meetings, so I hope that I'm not being too redundant. But one thing that I have been thinking about is just sort of when we talk about intangible cultural heritage and preservation of that, I think that also extends into just like real lived experiences and people who are alive and carrying on their traditions, of course. I feel like we've talked about that definitely, but especially thinking through this past year, and I know we don't love to think about it, but I don't know if we've had enough time to really talk about all the losses we've experienced from the pandemic. And I think from a more like popular aspect, something a lot of people connected over was the death of John Prine, for instance, and thinking of like the loss that came with his death, you know, whatever potential was still there, whatever time was left, it was taken too soon. And so I feel like intangible cultural heritage policy can also extend into any policy that has to do with supporting people living day to day. You know, thinking about like the blues musicians in Mississippi who live in rundown homes, for instance. Like that's an area in which people, they need basic things to survive. Like just people need a chance to to be comfortable, you know, at least, or a chance to live through a pandemic. So I think that that's just something that I think about in tangible cultural heritage. I think about every other policy that impacts someone's day to day. So thank you.
I've got a question for Michael. You kind of trapped me with your question about neoliberalism. You know, here's an economist asking a guy who doesn't even play one on Zoom what neoliberalism is in relation to the arts. And you sat there and let me walk out on a plank and kind of jump off talking about something I don't really know that much about. And you're an economist. I think so. I'd like you or Joanna or somebody, what do you think the context of neoliberalism means for the arts in general, the nonprofit arts in particular, and do you think there is such a context? I mean,
yeah, I guess I would to play my hand. I don't find it a helpful term because it does carry so many possible meanings.
Yeah.
Some people sometimes mean, well, it means sort of a almost libertarian marketization of everything. But that's contrary to the idea that neoliberals would want to use the arts for economic development or economic impact, because economists, probably more than anybody else, are skeptical of those kinds of claims. If you want to find critics of economic impact studies, go to your economics department. And they will say, no, this isn't how you do this. And so I find it confusing. Sometimes it means aspects of new public management. So you know, so it's meant to mean things like the logic model, dividing things into inputs and outputs and outcomes, and chains like that, and then choosing what outcome you're actually trying to achieve. Again, I find that difficult in the arts, because in the arts, sometimes we're imposing a false dichotomy. I was asking some of my colleagues the other day, if our local symphony, the Bloomington Symphony Orchestra, puts on a concert, is that an input to something or an output of something? Or is it just a concert, right? But we want to force these distinctions into a particular framework that I'm not sure fits, and that's really the new public management. So I guess this is where I worry about the use of neoliberal, as it can mean so many very different things, and I'm not sure it clarifies it. So I'm sorry to make you walk the plank that way on asking that question. You picked it up, but
you know, I've always had the impression that neoliberalism partly is confusing because either by choice or accident, it never really defined itself as a distinct ideological frame, the way Marxism did, or some, you know, because once neoliberalism becomes a real thing, then it can really be dismantled and attacked. As it is now, it just sort of drifts along with a lot of its component parts influencing society. But I think it can be gathered up into a thing, but I could be wrong. But
I think it's because it's often used as an epithet rather than a self-definition. A Marxist will call herself a Marxist. A Keynesian will call herself a Keynesian. But you rarely hear somebody say, yes, I'm very neoliberal.
Right.
So you know, it's used in a different context.
I mean, my response is going to be, it's generally used as a complaint about the current state of affairs. You don't really hear it otherwise.
Good for those neoliberals. Yes, you don't hear that phrase very much. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm always willing to say that maybe we've talked as much as we need to. You know, I mean, we have an agenda with a 5 o'clock cocktail hour, but as the great Jimmy Buffett and Alan Jackson said, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. So, you know, we don't have to force ourselves to keep trying to be smart. That's just an
All right.
observation.
Well, I will take Bill's lead. If there are no further comments, it has been, we started at almost 8 hours ago. It's been a terrific day. I've learned so much. We've had such a variety of perspectives and interesting cases from around the world, and it's just been wonderful. A lot of these ideas I'm going to take back into the classroom next year or do further investigation. I'm sure I'm speaking for many of us when we say that we'll do that. And again, to our presenters, to Valdemar, to our presenters of the different papers, to Sunil for organizing his panel. It's been truly a great day. We're so grateful for all of you being able to take part and share your wisdom and share what you've been working on, and seeing this as a continuous process of we're always learning and always synthesizing, and so I just can't thank you enough.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It was such a delightful day, and I really hope that in 2 years for our next biennial research conference, we will do this in person. But please keep in touch with us, because this is part of what we do here at the CCA. We get people together and we continue these conversations. So if that means attending our workshop series, signing up for our newsletter, just sending us an email, just keep in touch with us. We want to continue to build this community, and we're so happy to have had everybody here today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's great.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.